Hello, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How are you? If I could have your attention. I know people are still arriving, but we are going to get started. So if you're arriving, please do take a seat. I'd like to introduce Daniel Ross, a Wurundjeri man who's going to give us a wonderful welcome to country. Thank you, Daniel.
How colonial is a lectern? I don't like it. How do I welcome everybody to my home with my front door still closed? That's the way I see a lectern. It's a barrier, and yeah, it's no good. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Very good. If you can't hear me, come down here. My name's Daniel Ross, and I'm a proud Wurundjeri man. And I got a phone call about an hour ago to do tonight's welcome because Auntie Di wasn't feeling well. So I had to rush off and buy some new shoes and make it all look a bit flash. And I also got told I had 5 minutes for my welcome. That's out the window because our story starts at the beginning of time. And Bunjil is our creator, the wedge-tailed eagle, and he created intertwine. Do you want me to hold it? The roots of the trees intertwine through one another. The gum tree shares water from water sources. It's a lot like Indigenous knowledges through time, since millennia. Bunjil taught us how to care for country. It's not throwing grass seed out and hoping it doesn't rain so we can mow it on Sunday, but how we listen to one another, how we care for one another, how we listen to country, how we listen to when we take resources. One of the hardest seasons to talk about, but a relevant one, is Porneet, our season for spring. And when the wattle blooms, we pause and we check on our old people. Last year we lost significant elders during Porneet. But it's an exciting time. We see yam daisies coming to flower, tadpoles in ponds. 235 years ago, though, everything we knew changed. Is it for better? I'm still undecided, but we're here. The MCG once was a place of ceremony, song, dance, decimated for a sporting field. We were forced off home, Naarm, right where we are, to places like Bollum and Billabong, and eventually Corrandirk, the mission. They call that place Healesville today. But at Corrandirk, Uncle Billabong negotiated with one John Batman, the first treaty we saw. 12 axes, a few bags of rice, and a couple of blankets. The Crown ripped it up. We weren't worth that much. But true to how we learned through time, there was two little fellas at that signing, Uncle Simon Wonga and Uncle William Barak. Uncle Simon Wonga and Uncle Barak advocated tirelessly for Aboriginal people on the mission. We weren't allowed to speak our native tongue, yet we had to learn to read and write English to get a paycheck. So for anybody here who speaks a language other than English, please, I implore you to teach your children, because losing language is an absolute travesty to culture and identity, to who we all are. 1967, we had a referendum and we voted yes. Aboriginal people are human. I don't know about that, but I did put my foot in it a couple of weeks ago. I had to do a welcome for a religious organisation. And I told them baby Jesus was black. I didn't think I was going to get out alive. I'm not going to lie. But context is amazing. For any of those who don't understand the First Testament, it's 6,000 years old, give or take a year or two. And in the First Testament, they hide baby Jesus in Egypt, a country of colour, for over a month. If baby Jesus was fair skinned in a country of colour 6,000 years ago, he would have been a prized possession. But right here in Victoria, our home state, we have places that have human occupation at over 120,000 years down near Warrnambool on Gunditjmara country. It just shows our connection to the beginning of time is slowly allowing science to catch up. But Uncle Barak gave my great-grandmother the tribal name, White Bullum. Nan was fair skin and fair hair, but by the old term, full blood. I'm not sure if you've paused recently, but there's a lot of white butterflies flying around. Gentle, caring, nurturing. Nan was instrumental in the opening of the first health service for Indigenous people right here in Victoria. Not too long after the referendum, I started school. A proud little Aboriginal boy. I wanted to share my stories with everybody, some of which I've shared with you today from my aunties, uncles, grandparents. Except my first day of school was terrible. I was pulled down, told I wasn't Aboriginal because I was white. I didn't want to go back. It was terrible. And my grandfather pulled me aside. Very wise, our old people. And he explained to me the reason that I was fair-skinned and my cousins weren't was because I was born in the daytime and they were born at night. But when I got older, the truth came out. We were always encouraged not to date other Indigenous girls purely because we didn't know where our families were put when we were taken and forced off what we knew was home. My family's lucky enough that we've been heavily documented just next door in the library. We're able to trace a lot of our family ties and our stories, but a lot of community isn't so fortunate. Last year in the workplace, I work for an Aboriginal-led business now. And this feeds into what everybody's here for tonight. And I've been subjected to comments like, oh, you're still sniffing petrol? Which toe's Aboriginal? Well, no, they use the 3-letter version, but it's atrocious. And I've wanted to quit time and time again. But if I quit, who stands up for the other Indigenous fellas in the workforce? But things that, as a business, they don't measure is in those 3 years on that journey, I've seen 8 Indigenous fellas buy their first home in their families, creating generational change for their children, generational wealth for future generations. And that's what keeps us going. What are we doing just like our old people? Not for us, but for everyone. And that brings us back to Bunjil's law in what we do and why we do it, how we listen, care for one another, and move forward collectively. But before I welcome you all to my home, my ancestors' home, I'd like to pay my respects to my elders. But I'd like to pause and pay my respects to all of you and acknowledge your elders past and present also, and to any other First Nations in the room. Woman Jika Wurundjeri Bulak, Yemen Gundibek. In the Woiwurrung language, I just said, welcome to the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. Our traditional lands go west to the Werribee River, north to the Great Divide, east to Mount Borbor, and south to Mordialloc Creek. Nun Godjan, thank you.
My name's Andrew Hudson. I'm the CEO of the Centre for Policy Development, or CPD. Thank you, Daniel, for that really powerful welcome to country. I'm delighted to celebrate and acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, as we've just heard, the first peoples of the lands here. I'd like to extend my acknowledgement of country to those of you who are online in the various locations around Australia. CPD is very excited by the First Peoples developments underway in Victoria here. The Yurok Justice Commission that's seeking the truth about human rights violations committed in this state. And we're excited by the treaty about to be negotiated in Victoria by Australia's biggest First Peoples democratically elected body, and dare I say it, voice to government, the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria. And it's wonderful that we have some individuals from those institutions with us tonight. Taking the lead from the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, CPD is very supportive of the referendum later this year to enshrine a First Peoples voice in Australia's constitution. In many different areas, CPD's work has shown that the best policy is created when people affected by the policy are consulted on it and involved in its creation. and that's why we think the voice is vital. And it's fitting to mention our support for the voice here tonight, because our last oration was delivered by Indigenous lawyer Professor Megan Davis. As a member of the Prime Minister's Referendum Council, Professor Davis was instrumental in the development of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. At the last oration, she told us, quote, "It's important that constitutional reform for First Nations people is regarded as a discrete and serious issue of public policy." And she finished by declaring, quote, "It's just time to bring it home," end quote. And I hope that that's what we do as a nation later this year. Welcome to CPD's flagship event, the John Menadue Oration. John was founding chair of CPD in 2007 and will meet Sophie in Canberra next week. As a public servant, he led various government departments helping to secure profound policy reform such as Medicare, but he also worked in the private sector, including as CEO of Qantas and at News Limited. And I should say, we were supposed to have our Auslan interpreters here, and they were confirmed, but at the last minute they experienced staff shortages due to the overwhelmingly popular festival that we have going on, the Comedy Festival. So we got bumped. In these orations, we explore big policy ideas, and today we'll be discussing the wellbeing economy and wellbeing government. And I'll leave Sophie to talk more about what wellbeing means. But suffice to say, there's considerable political momentum in Australia, and that's why CPD brought Sophie here in this moment. It's great that we can say Australia is committed to embedding a wellbeing approach to government through the Measuring What Matters initiative championed by the Federal Treasurer. The first draft of this new national framework on wellbeing was announced just last week. Almost every state and territory is engaging in efforts to advance wellbeing by championing approaches that can meet the needs of people, communities and the environment, and embedding new approaches to policy design and decision-making that focus on long-term quality of life rather than solely economic growth. CPD's work in this area supports governments in their aspirations and approaches. Our 2022 report on global wellbeing approaches, Redefining Progress, showed Wales as one of the global leaders, and Sophie has played a significant role in this leadership. At CPD, we know that measurement is just one step. We've been working with the federal government to expand their consultation around wellbeing to be more inclusive and community focused, and are delighted to see the government announce new plans in this regard last week. This is something that Wales did very well. And I think what came out of the Welsh model was a sense of shared purpose across Wales that helped decision making and assisted those in government to engage innovative, long-term, effective solutions that work for people, planet and future generations. CPD has organised a long list of meetings for you, Sophie, perhaps exhaustive list of meetings over the next 2 weeks with politicians, the private sector, young people in Melbourne, Canberra and Sydney, as well as featuring in really influential media outlets, including yesterday on ABC Radio, The Project and Q&A next week. I hope you don't mind if I take just a couple of minutes to highlight CPD's unique work and strong impact. We tackle the biggest policy challenges facing Australia and the region and take people on the journey of solving them. Our work advances the wellbeing of current and future generations across a range of vital issues. In addition to wellbeing, CPD is working on 4 main areas. First, supporting Australian leadership and cooperation in Southeast Asia with a focus on forced migration, Australia-Indonesia relations, Myanmar and climate change. We have a wonderful team in Jakarta that I know are watching and recently helped coordinate a regional response to the alarming uptick in refugees leaving Myanmar and Bangladesh. Second, building an economy that is clean, innovative and productive. This includes tackling climate change by changing economic and finance policy to promote a just transition. For example, we've worked closely with the federal government to create new rules mandating that companies disclose their climate risk. This new transparency will help investments flow to the greenest parts of our economy and away from fossil fuels. Thirdly, supporting a government that is active and effective by building out a universal early childhood development system that makes Australia the best place to be a child and raise a family. CPD has worked closely with state and federal governments on the recent once-in-a-generation changes to make childcare cheaper and expand parental leave. And fourth, we're also forging a society that expands opportunity and social justice through people and place-centred services and shared missions between government and local communities, especially in relation to employment. We coordinate an exciting demonstration site in Western Melbourne that shows how employment services can be delivered better in a localised and place-based environment. And uniquely, we show the linkages between all these areas of policy reform to help government engage in systems-level change that's holistic and cross-disciplinary. We anticipate those long-term policy challenges and build coalitions and connections to chart out realistic solutions. Well, enough from me. You haven't come to hear from me. I'm not even on the slide. So I'll now hand over to CPD Chair Sam Mostyn, who will moderate tonight's proceedings. Sam will be well known to many of you, and it would be impossible to list all of your incredible achievements, accolades and affiliations, Sam. She's been a singular presence on CPD's board for over 6 years, is a leading Australian change maker on issues from women's equality to climate, business, sport and more. She's been a champion for systems change in boardrooms around Australia and is currently the chair of Aware Super and chairs the federal government's Women's Economic Equality Task Force. Sam, thanks so much for moderating tonight, and over to you.
Good evening, everybody. I would, of course, like to start by acknowledging the land that we're on tonight and to acknowledge the elders of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. But I'd mostly like to thank Daniel, who I know has been up since 4:30 this morning and came in at the last minute. And we had a wonderful conversation behind the scenes talking about the links between the way you live your life and how you welcomed us this evening, Daniel, and the topic that we're exploring tonight. So it's very special that you were able to stand in, and I think we're all so much more profoundly affected by a welcome of the kind that you've given us. And I wanted to thank you, and perhaps we could thank Daniel again for the fact that he's still up after an early start. I wear this pin as a signal that I will be voting yes in the referendum. As Andrew has said, CPD certainly has a deep interest in ensuring that policy is informed by those for whom it has greatest effect. For me personally, the reason I like to say what I intend to do is because I spent a lot of time with many of the women leaders of the dialogues from many years ago, and it was a leader of the dialogues, Pat Anderson, together with Megan Davis, who gave me this pin, which was created by Alison Page. She's an Indigenous woman from the north coast of New South Wales, and she turned this into a pin, and it is the artefacts that were given to the Uluru Dialogue leaders as they left Uluru with the canvas to come to the rest of us, particularly to non-Indigenous Australians, to ask us to play our role as citizens in the months ahead. Not just to vote yes, but to educate ourselves and have the kind of conversations about why a voice matters and what our role is in that. And I wear that as a symbol to remind me of the job at hand, but also to listen to Daniel. We had a good conversation that these are not just easy decisions to make for any of us, but I think the best thing we can all do is educate ourselves, talk with one another, learn from one another, so that when we go into that ballot box, as Pat Anderson has always said, we go in with a clear conscience and a decision to do something profoundly good for the nation. So, Daniel, that's why it's so important that you've been here this evening and helping us start tonight. There are many special guests here tonight. You are all special guests, of course. I do need to reflect on the fact that my former chair is here, Terry Moran. And Terry, it's been tough stepping into your shoes as chair of CPD, and I learnt a lot through your leadership. And I'm delighted that you could join us tonight with many fellow members of the CPD board, our fellows, many of you who are attached to CPD, and those of you that just believe in great policy and discussions like the one tonight. Now let's get to the discussion at hand. Sophie Howe is the world's first public official appointed as a guardian of the interests of future generations. She's also been called the world's first public minister of the unborn by The Guardian, and was recently even accused of being part of a Welsh plot to save the world by the New Statesman. I think we know who Sophie is and what she's doing. After completing her 7-year term as Wales' inaugural Future Generations Commissioner in January, Sophie is here in Australia, as you've heard, to share lessons, impacts and insights on wellbeing. In 2015, Wales became the first country in the world to set a legislative requirement for public decision makers to act in the interests of future generations. Imagine that. Sophie was appointed in 2016 really as a new kind of public official. She advised government and other public bodies in Wales on delivering social, economic, environmental and cultural wellbeing for current and future generations and oversaw its delivery. She led high-profile interventions around transport planning, education and climate change, challenging the Welsh Government and others to demonstrate just how they were taking account of future generations. Prior to her role as the inaugural Commissioner, Sophie had a long range of government roles working on issues as diverse as police and crime, community safety, housing, regeneration, equality and so much more. Sophie, I'm delighted to invite you to the stage to deliver our John Menadue Oration tonight with the topic of Can a Wellbeing Economy Deliver? Please welcome Sophie Howe.
Well, thank you very much, Sam, and particular thanks to Daniel. We have a few things in common, I think. Both of us, it seems, were up at 4:30 a.m. Me, due to being very far from my home. You also due to being far from your home, but in different contexts. Oh dear. But also, some parallels there in how you described use of the language and the punitive approach taken to use of your language. Similar issues happened in Wales with the Welsh language. So, diolch yn fawr iawn am siarad I fi. Diolch yn fawr iawn am y croeso a'r cofio'n cynnes iawn I chi. That is, thank you so much for your warm welcome. We send our warmest wishes to you from Wales and certainly support what you described there in terms of use of the language. In fact, Welsh, we believe, is one of the fastest growing minority languages because actually of the decisions that our government has taken. So I think it's fitting that as we look to the past, and we've heard of some of those particular challenges in the past from Daniel, and I think look to the past with a passion. I hope to put right some of the wrongs. We should also look to the future, because what we do now will develop and deliver that future. We must look to the future because the best way to predict the future is for us actually to create it. But first, I suppose, to the past. And I wanted to start with some of the predictions of what people back in the year 1923 thought that we might be doing in 2023. So I can officially declare that you no longer have to work hard. Just a mere 4 hours a day, so we can all relax, we can put our feet up and we can let electricity do the work. Or at least that was declared as what was going to happen back in 1923. Some other predictions. We should worry, God forbid, a man with curly hair and a woman with shaved heads and black teeth. But, you know, at least we're all going to live to being 300, so we'll take the good with the bad. And maybe living to 300 years old is something to do with the utensils made from pulp. Maybe that had a significant contribution to that longevity. So I think it's always interesting to find out what our ancestors predicted for today with limited access of the knowledge of the world that we have now. And these predictions for 2023 may sound bizarre, but all of them actually have a partial truth, or at least some understanding of the world that we might be living in 2023. Because we are indeed living longer, not quite 300 years yet, but children born today are expected to have a very good chance of living beyond 100 years. The way that we work is changing and has changed drastically over the last number of years, the last century in particular, and is set to change even further as we enter into this digital revolution. Well, we're in the middle of a digital revolution and it's getting faster and faster. We've seen shorter working week pilots, there's some significant ones in the UK. Might not be 4 hours a day, but a reduced working week is gathering traction. The use of materials has changed, including the materials we use for utensils. Wales is actually legislating to ban single-use plastics for things like cutlery. It's coming into force this year. And the way we understand gender has changed over the past decade, with our understanding of gender as a social construct and a wider understanding of gender fluidity. But our predictions for the future now aren't quite as bizarre or amusing. And the Global Risk Report predicts that the most likely events to cause havoc in our world. Now, in 2006, the first iteration of the Global Risk Report, researchers flagged the acute risk of an influenza pandemic to our population, the impact of climate change on our people and our planet. And these findings appear again and again in the annual report. So a decade ago, the same or very similar risks were flagged, and yet we were blindsided by COVID-19, and we continue to be nonchalant in the face of climate change. All systems, I say, of a failure of governance across the world to make decisions with future generations in mind. Now, there's actually some neurological reasons for this. Studies have come to light which show when we think of ourselves in the future, our brains fire up in such a way that it's more similar to when we're thinking about a stranger. So these studies say that when you think about yourself, your present self, the medial prefrontal cortex, a part of your brain, is activated. And then if you think about someone else, it kind of powers down. So if you're asked to think about someone you do not know or someone you have no connection with, this area of your brain is stimulated even less. But it's been found the more distant we think about ourselves, even in the future, there's actually parallels to us, the brain activity, when we're thinking about someone completely disconnected, someone we've never met or have no connection to whatsoever. So there's a neurological reason why our brains are kind of hardwired, if you like, to ignore the future. It makes sense, right? It's probably why we're also bad for planning for retirement. It's why we might have an extra donut or glass of wine, even though we know it's bad for our long-term health. But the world actually is in a crisis, and a polycrisis being the buzzword at the moment. So we're caught up in conflict, polarization, fueled by increasing wealth inequality, life expectancy beginning to plateau, and emissions increasing. So what legacy are we leaving behind to our future generations? So if we look 50,000 years to the past, there have been about 100 billion people who were once alive and are now dead. Currently, there's around about 8 billion people living on planet Earth. So we can see the dead here represented by the grey dot, currently living the green, little green dot. But if we look 50,000 years to the future, there are around about 6.75 trillion people who are yet to be born. And the lives that they lead will, in no small part, be determined by the decisions that we take today. because many of the challenges that they will face we know about today, just as many of our predecessors knowingly stored up the problems that we are facing today. In terms of climate change, for example, we have put more carbon into the atmosphere since the UN published their first framework for action on climate change in 1992, and since Al Gore published his first version of An Inconvenient Truth, than at any other time during human history. So we've done that knowingly, or if you want to put it a bit more politely, we have been willfully blind or willfully ignorant, because the action we need to take, if we choose to see it, is, well, as Al Gore put it, too inconvenient. And when I say we, of course, our individual behaviours all add up to the problems that we now see. But let's be honest, actually the we is really about a small number of politicians and corporate giants who have put profit over planet. And as a member 5, and including 3 teens within my 5 future generations, I've got into a bit of hip-hop lately. And if you listen to some of the lyrics with some of our hip-hop artists, these kids are actually calling us out, quite rightly calling us out. This is British artist Loyal Kana, who hits the nail on the head when he says, "Never has so much been lost by so many because of the indecision of so few." But maybe our future generations are coming full circle, because our ancestors, in some cases, mostly actually in respect of Indigenous peoples, are much better at deploying the longer-term thinking we need. Take the Iroquois, who are famous for their 7th generation thinking. So for too long, the wisdom of Indigenous people and of small nations has been forgotten or ignored. Look to Bhutan, who measure all their decisions against a gross happiness index. Imagine if we measured everything against how happy it made us. And that's not just the soft and fluffy stuff. So in Bhutan, they've recorded an average growth in annual GDP of 7.5% since the early 1980s. Poverty levels have declined from 36% in 2007 to 10% in 2021, and they are the only carbon negative country in the world, and they measure all their decisions by happiness. Take Finland, Iceland, Scotland, your neighbours in New Zealand, who are all moving beyond GDP to measure decisions on the basis of planetary and human well-being. And take Wales, my country, Cymru. Known as the land of song and culture, from Tom Jones, Gareth Bale, if you're into soccer, has the home, actually, of your former Prime Minister Julia Gillard, and occasionally for beating you at rugby. Not that often. But we're also known, actually, for being at the forefront of the coal trade, where in our capital city, Cardiff, the first £1 million cheque for coal was signed. And this is quite an interesting picture here. This is when the first £1 million cheque for coal was signed. And on the left, what you can see here is the publication in the same place, the Coal Exchange in Cardiff, of Wales's plan to reach net zero. So we want to be at the forefront now of the well-being revolution, a country which puts the well-being of people and planet and of our future generations at the forefront of our decision-making. And in 2015, Wales became the first country in the world to legislate to do just that. So what does the legislation actually do? First of all, it requires all of our main public institutions, our local health boards, our local authorities, our national institutions like our Environment Agency, our public health agencies, and significantly the Welsh Government itself, to demonstrate how they are meeting today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It then sets out 7 long-term well-being goals. Now, this is the important part. These goals were devised in conversation with the citizens of Wales. We held a national conversation or dialogue. It was called The Wales We Want. Over 10,000 citizens engaged, gave their views on the Wales they wanted to leave behind to their children, their grandchildren, and future generations to come. And they told us that they wanted to protect their natural assets for the next generation, that fairness and community were important, as was our language, culture and heritage. These were things that we wanted to be able to pass on. And at the same time, the UN Sustainable Development Goals were in development, so we looked to what was happening at a global level, we looked to a local level, to what the people of Wales told us, and we came up with these goals. Now, they all have their own statutory definitions, and the duties on public bodies are to set objectives which maximise their contribution to all of the goals. But there's one in particular that I want to pull out. I'm not sure how well you can read that, certainly from the back, but I'm going to pick out the key words in the statutory definition of a prosperous Wales. A productive, innovative, low-carbon society, one which uses resources efficiently and proportionately, recognising the limits of the global environment, develops a skilled population with opportunities for decent work. That has taken us off in a completely different path. Just that one goal, before we even get into the duties to apply all the goals, just that one goal is taking us off towards a wellbeing economy. So the duties on all public bodies covered by the Act are to set objectives which maximise their contribution to the goals, and then take all reasonable steps to deliver those objectives, not only in the way that they deliver policy and services, but in every aspect of what they do, how they deploy their budget, how they procure, how they plan and develop assets, manage risk, and plan their workforce. So it sounds quite difficult and expansive so far. So the Act establishes an independent commissioner to oversee the change, to act as a coach and a referee, so to advise and support these public bodies on how they reach those wellbeing goals, and to monitor and assess the progress. Now, the Act doesn't give the independent commissioner powers to force anyone to do anything or to stop anyone doing anything. Really, they are name and shame, calling out powers, acting as the law says, possibly the coolest job description in the world, as the guardian of the interests of the future generations of Wales, no pressure over the last 7 years. But really, that power to be the conscience of future generations. And I describe really the powers as being a lot about calling out the madness of short-term decision-making, which disregards those yet to be born. But also, in my experience, of course, we've got the law on the one hand, what the statute says, and then we've got what that means in reality. So inspiring new and progressive policy ideas and action, being the figurehead for those who dare to think the impossible is possible, holding the hands of the triers, breaking down the barriers that they experience, convening potential partners, a lot of banging heads together, using public platforms to speak out, and threatening to use review powers. They're the toughest of the Commissioner's powers. I can go in and review a particular decision or a particular organisation, and they have to cooperate with me, respond to my recommendations, and so on. But although this is a law and that has its own specific and unique power, essentially what this is the biggest cultural change programme Wales, and I'd argue possibly any country, has ever seen. And so finally, the Act sets out a toolkit for the ways in which our institutions should change the ways they work to achieve these goals, with powers also for our Auditor General to audit how these ways of working are being applied. Here you can see the architecture of the Act, the goals measured by 50 national indicators and milestones set by government, a future trends report which our institutions have to use to identify what long-term trends they should be taking into account, and then these 5 ways of working. So firstly, they must consider the long term. What would the long-term impact be of the things that they're thinking of doing? They should use future trends and scenarios, including the Future Trends report. The Welsh Government publishes it every couple of years. Secondly, they must seek to prevent problems from occurring or from getting worse. So an attempt at shifting from parking our ambulance at the bottom of a river and pulling someone out when they're drowning to getting upstream and trying to prevent them falling in the river in the first place. They must involve citizens in finding solutions. Now, note that word involve. It's different to consult, it's different to engage. It's a much deeper sense of co-production with our citizens in finding solutions to meeting our goals. They must collaborate or work together between each other, in the public sector, but also with the private and voluntary sectors, with housing associations, further and higher education, recognising that no one body can meet the challenges of seizing the opportunities for meeting our wellbeing goals alone. The Act also sets up some specific mechanisms for this to happen through the establishment of what are called public services boards, a statutory board made up of all of our key public service institutions and the voluntary sector, sometimes the private sector and so on, in each local authority, area or region. Finally, they must integrate their actions, so they must recognise the connections between goals, each of the 7 wellbeing goals, policy areas and services. So, for example, if we want to meet our goal of prosperity, we must make sure that we're taking steps to both protect against the economic impact of climate change, but also join the dots to take advantage of the green revolution to develop the high-quality green jobs of the future. Because there are no jobs on a dead planet, but there are high-quality green jobs which can address poverty, inequality and improve health that are actually needed to enable us to deliver net zero. So whatever point or issue or policy you start from, it's about making these long-term connections which delivers the wellbeing magic. So if we take health, for example, now in previous times, we might have set a goal for a healthier Wales. I mean, who doesn't want a healthier population? But we would have quickly sent that task off to our much-loved National Health Service to deliver. Makes sense, right? Health Service delivers health of a nation. Wrong. The biggest determinants of health of the nation actually have very little to do with what the healthcare system itself does. In fact, in many cases, the system itself is a main contributor to the problems which cause ill health. Take the fact that the healthcare system, if we rounded up all of our healthcare systems globally and packaged them as a country, they would be the 5th biggest emitters of carbon in the world. But then that's something for another lecture. So if we look at actually what makes the difference in terms of our health, 35% of what makes a difference in terms of the gaps in life expectancy. And do you know what? Where I live in Cardiff, in the north of Cardiff, there's a 20-year difference in life expectancy between the north of Cardiff and the south of Cardiff, just 5 miles down the road. And what are the reasons for those differences? Well, 35% of what makes a difference is about income security, people living in poverty. 29% is about living conditions, the quality of our homes, whether we're living in areas of high air pollution, do we have access to nature? This concept of us all wanting, as we describe in the UK, of living in the leafy suburbs actually has substance because it has a direct correlation to our health and life expectancy. And what's also really interesting, but obvious in many ways, is that 19% of what makes a difference to life expectancy is about social and human capital. So what's the quality of your relationships and your connections? Do we have people that we can turn to? Is there a sense of community in the place that we live? And do we have agency in that community? So for many politicians and policymakers, this has been the kind of soft and fluffy stuff, the stuff that the state doesn't have a role in, but actually far from being soft and fluffy, it relates back to a hardcore metrics of how long we're going to live. And so what we're trying to do with this approach is to connect the dots, find the sweet spots that deliver well-being, recognise and respond to those connections in our policymaking and delivery of public services. It's why Monmouthshire Council in South Wales became the first public authority to take on the running of a post office. Why? To stop that community facility leaving the area and breaking down a space for communities to connect. It's why a representative from our Environment Agency, who sits on one of our public services boards, described to me when I visited them the role that our Environment Agency could play in tackling adverse childhood experiences. It's the thing that eludes governments, public institutions and almost every organisation in the world, the removal of silos and the coming together beyond boundaries to deliver well-being for all. So how might this play out in a live policy issue? So let's take a problem, perhaps, which most countries in the world are grappling with in one shape or form. How do we ensure our transport systems fit for the future? How, in particular, might we reduce our carbon emissions from transport in line with meeting our carbon targets? And this is where we find this approach particularly useful. This is known as the 3 horizons. So you can see here, Horizon 1, the red line. What will happen if we carry on with business as usual? Well, we'll be on a downward trajectory, our emissions will keep escalating, we won't meet our climate targets, and so on. Horizon 3, the green line, is where we want to be. What is the new normal that we want to create? And this is the really important bit in Wales. We actually know what that is. Can you say, as a country, you know where Australia want to be? I can imagine that people in this room will have a pretty good idea, but have you had that dialogue with Australians? Is there an agreed national position set out in the law to say this is where we want to be? No, there's not. And it's critically important that you have that vision. And from our perspective, that vision is our 7 wellbeing goals. So we know that whenever we're searching for policy solutions, those solutions need to maximise all aspects of those 7 wellbeing goals. Horizon 2 then, what are the things that we need to do, or what are the innovations in play that will help us to get to Horizon 3? Now here's the trick. The things you might do to solve one problem might not be the things that you should do if you're seeking to improve well-being overall. In fact, they might just take you back to reinforcing business as usual. So you can see there that Horizon 2 negative. So, for example, if you just wanted to decarbonise the transportation system, then mass investment in electric vehicles, grants for electric vehicle infrastructure and so on might be the answer. The problem with that, however, is that EVs still have an environmental impact in their production. It means that we're all still sat in traffic congestion in our EVs rather than in our petrol cars. It means we're all still getting fatter and adding to the obesity crisis and not connecting with our communities. And it means that the poorer people who couldn't afford to buy a diesel or a petrol vehicle definitely can't afford to buy an electric vehicle, even with an EV grant. So when you apply a holistic wellbeing lens, you find that EV infrastructure and investment is actually not the answer at all. A much better investment and solution for environment, for equality, for community and health is to invest in walking, cycling and public transport, which is exactly what a hard-fought battle using the Future Generations Act means that we're doing in Wales. Now, transport, this is a live sort of case because transport was the first biggest test of the Act. Specifically, government proposals to spend around £1.5 billion, or to borrow, actually, £1.5 billion to build a 13-mile stretch of motorway to deal with this very problem of congestion on the M4 around Newport. And as I said, this funding equated to the entire of the Welsh Government's borrowing capacity. The route went through a nature reserve, which you can see here, but it was argued, as it usually is, that it was a necessary piece of infrastructure for Wales's economy. In fact, the Conservative Secretary of State from the UK government argued that the congestion at Newport was a foot on the throat of the economy in Wales, so it must be built. Now, as Commissioner, I intervened in this decision and I asked the government to explain to me how they'd applied the Future Generations Act. How was it in line with the goal of a more prosperous Wales, which talks about prosperity within the context of acting on climate change? How it met the goal of a more resilient Wales, which is about ecological resilience when it would permanently damage the nature in this reserve. How it was in line with the goal of a healthier Wales with rising levels of air pollution and obesity. And how it was in line with the goal of a more equal Wales when 25% of the lowest income families in that area don't even own a car. So we'd essentially be spending the entire of the government's borrowing capacity on a plan which benefited the already better off. So the government found it really hard to answer these questions. And consequently, and against all expectations, because usually when there's an argument, and these things usually play out, economy versus environment, and what happens, economy always wins and environment always loses, which is why we're in the middle of a climate emergency. But actually, when we play out the wider issues around well-being, the First Minister changed his mind. He cancelled the road building scheme, set up a commission to look at alternative options, with their terms of reference being set around find the options which are going to best deliver across all of the wellbeing goals. So instead, the government is now planning to spend half the money improving public transport and active travel routes in the area. And it didn't stop there. These interventions are my ongoing challenge to government about how we were spending capital infrastructure investment, how their policies were accounting for the long term and applying wellbeing holistically, led to a totally new transport strategy, prioritising active travel as a transport solution and putting private car use at the bottom of the transport hierarchy, a shift in infrastructure investment. We were previously spending 2/3 of our infrastructure investment budget on building roads in the middle of a climate emergency, should I add. But in the last budget round, this went down to 1/3, with that switch in funding going into public transport and active travel. A moratorium on road building, I should say that again. There is pretty much a ban on road building in Wales, with 55 pre-approved road schemes halted and all reviewed in line with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. The rollout of standardised 20-mile-an-hour speed limits in all residential areas across Wales, and a range of innovative trials from electric bike loan schemes to buses on demand to closing school streets to traffic. So a major transformation in transport, but what else has changed? So in health, we're seeing some encouraging steps towards joined-up prevention. I have to say that this is one of the difficult areas, because we can't turn off the tap on hospitals. We can't close hospitals and save money there, even though we know that actually in the long term it would be better to invest in prevention in communities. But we are seeing some interesting innovations. So from doctors being able to issue free bike hire on prescription, community wellbeing hubs focusing on tackling the wider determinants of physical and mental health, the first hospital-based solar farm in the UK, so making that connection between them being an emitter and that having an impact on health, to the hospital site which decided not to sell surplus land for development, but use the Future Generations Act to make the case that instead they should use that land, develop it for the community with food growing, land management skills programmes, space for restoring and connecting with nature. Perhaps one of the biggest steps, or first steps, is the first government-backed pilot of a universal basic income in the UK. Now, I know that this is a controversial subject, but I take you back to those wider determinants of health, 35% of which relate to income security and poverty. And when our welfare system was created in the UK, the gig economy was not a thing. Zero-hour contracts were not a thing. And our welfare system is failing. We know that poverty costs the healthcare system £29 billion every year in the UK. And I have strongly advocated for a change to that. My report on Wales introducing a universal basic income showed that we could halve poverty in Wales with a UBI. But still, just a few years ago, it was considered impossible. But last year, the Welsh Government launched their first trial, initially targeted towards young people leaving the state care system, who are now receiving an unconditional income of £1,600 per month with a big evaluation wrapped around it. When does reducing waste also help to tackle loneliness? When a holistic wellbeing approach is applied. Now, Wales has a really strong track record on waste. We're third in the world for our rates of recycling, but in line with our wellbeing goals, we've set an aspiration to be a zero waste nation by 2050. But of course, because we have these duties to think about how we do that in a way which maximises the contribution to all of the goals, we want to do that in a way which also reduces poverty, brings communities together, and so on. So we've set up, as you can see here, community repair shops where people can go along and get their phone, their microwave, their television, or whatever repaired by volunteers instead of buying new. Volunteering is good for your health, it's good for community, and we're also helping to reduce waste. The library of things, where you can go and borrow anything from a tent to a lawnmower. School uniform swap shops, so hard-up parents don't need to be spending hundreds of pounds kitting out their children for the school year, but instead can reuse the uniform from the kids in the year above at the cost of a couple of pounds, raising funds for the school and keeping waste from landfill. And of course, in these here you can see some of the benefits, from carbon to community connection to cost savings in a cost of living crisis, putting that money, if you like, back in people's pockets. And of course, education, arguably the most important long-term intervention that we can make. So a new curriculum in Wales centred around the wellbeing goals, with the purpose of what it's seeking to achieve being the aim to prepare and equip children, not just for the jobs of the future, but actually to have lives well lived. So our outcomes from the curriculum, or the purpose of our curriculum, is to develop ambitious and capable learners with a lust for lifelong learning. Enterprising and creative contributors, recognising the importance of creativity as a key skill for the future. So when we're all, working alongside robots and doing our essays on ChatGPT and doing all of those things that people didn't think would happen, actually, the really important things are the human skills: empathy, emotional intelligence, creativity, the things that robots can't do. But also important is for us to develop healthy and confident individuals, recognising that as a society, our physical and mental health is as important, if not more important, actually, than our economic output and our academic achievement. And finally, ethical and informed citizens. Now, what if every single one of us in this room, what if every single politician taking decisions today in government across the world had been through an education system which taught them to be ethical and informed citizens? Would we be living in a climate emergency? Would we be seeing rising wealth inequality? So our curriculum is teaching our kids to be ethical and informed, to reconnect with nature, to act on a climate emergency, to understand what's going on in the world around them, including mandatory education on Black history, for example. So I could tell you more about the good things, the champions who are using ACT to change the way they procure, the doctors who are reforming city-centre transport strategies, the engineers who are greening our cities, and the economic agencies who are focused on delivering and developing sustainable food supply chains. But I can also tell you that it's not been easy, and we still have a huge amount of work to do. It's not enough to have a framework for people to follow, even if it's a legislative one, because human nature does not like change. And you'll find that without strong oversight, supportive and challenging interventions, that the system won't actually change what it does. It will just use new wellbeing words to describe it. A framework which sits as the responsibility of one minister or organisation has a chance of changing a rule of the game, but it won't change the game itself. We've learned that the lessons here, that unless it's everyone's business and becomes both the overarching and underpinning framework for everything a country does, then it will get lost whenever the next political initiative comes along. And we've also learned that this needs system-wide reform. At the beginning of our journey, this new approach was all well and good, but nothing else aligned with it. And I spent a lot of time in my early years as Commissioner doing the really unsexy stuff of unpicking systems of old, because yes, the Act was an all-encompassing framework, but if you looked to the various strategies, plans and regulations, they were at odds with it. Make long-term plans, we said, but here's your budget for 1 year. Work together, we said, but the systems of governance will still hold just one of you accountable. Prevent problems, we said, but we're still going to hold you account primarily and intensively on short-term performance measures. Has your ambulance turned up on time? How long did it take you to see your GP? How satisfied were you with your 10-minute GP appointment? A better question is, how satisfied are you with your life? That is when we start getting to the root cause. Involve citizens, we said, but austerity measures have stripped away all of the resources that you previously had for doing this. Take risks, we said, and try new things, but we'll crucify you in audit if you get it wrong. So we've had to rebuild or reconstruct from scratch new ways for the whole system to work, and that is still a work in progress. And so there are a lot of barriers, and this links to one of the things that we've learned, the need to turn a piece of legislation beyond its process and bureaucratic requirements to something inspiring. And if there's one lesson that I can leave you with, it's that. To find the people in the system, and I call them the frustrated champions. These are the people who for a long time have been able to see that there's a better way of doing things, but the system has frustrated them. Because these are the people who've been waiting for something like this and will become the first to use it, to do different things, to challenge the system, the abominable no-men, as I call them, in the system, to use them to challenge that system and to walk a path to the new normal. So the best way, of course, for us to prepare for the future is for us to walk that path with them and create it with them. And finally, the importance of having a champion to inspire and lead the change, who is a platform to shout out when things are going off track. In our case, a commissioner, but could be another entity. Governments actually marking their own homework doesn't necessarily end well in terms of outcomes, as you're relying on the system to challenge itself. But inspiration, hope, and leadership are equally important. We might get better understanding what the big challenges ahead of us are, but in a world where the future is so often presented as a dystopia, we must give people hope and a vision of where we want to get to. Otherwise, the challenges seem too big, and we feel too hopeless, and we risk defeatism becoming the new denialism. And so we have sought to build a movement beyond government, which in itself is a driver for action. Now, Sam will like this one, because in Wales, the Football Association have embraced the Act, not because they had to, but because they were inspired by it. Now, if you follow soccer, we call it football. Do you guys call it soccer? I don't know. Not your type of football. This is British football. In Wales, last year, Wales went to the World Cup for the first time in 64 years. This was big, big news in Wales. So as the team were preparing to go off to the World Cup, what did we do 3 days before? We launched their first wellbeing strategy, Wales, Wellbeing in the World, where the Football Association of Wales has based everything it's intending to do around our 7 wellbeing goals. And what was the first thing that they delivered of the actions in that plan that we co-created together? Equal pay between the male and female teams. The first country in the world, the first national football in the team to pay men and women equally. Voluntary sector organisations are using it as their framework to work beyond their boundaries. So the nature charities are working on health programmes or recognising that they're predominantly white, and so they need to do more to reach the goal of a more equal Wales. This outside movement is powerful and should be seen as a key part of making the aspirations of the Act happen in government itself. And of course, young people. Involve them, use their expertise, use their straight-talking challenge to leaders on how they're acting in their interests. We've lowered the voting age to 16 in Wales, we've established a youth parliament and a Future Leaders Academy set up by my office, who are leading the charge on behalf of young people in Wales, in their own organisations and sectors. And one of the most interesting things that these future leaders have done is to reverse mentor existing leaders. So 50 of them paired with current leaders in Wales, the most senior leaders in Wales. So from the Permanent Secretary, the head of the Welsh Government Civil Service, to the Chief Executive of Public Health Wales, to the SMT of our major construction companies. The power of having these digital natives who are much more likely to experience climate anxiety and be navigating the complex landscape of misinformation, mental health, identity and inequality, they have a thing or two to teach current leaders who are making decisions on their behalf. So far from our current leaders, our more experienced people imparting their wisdom on our younger generations are imparting their wisdom on leaders who have failed them. And our final lesson is never think that you are too small. As individuals, of course, our actions add up. As leaders, our decisions will play out for decades and sometimes centuries to come. And as a small country of just over 3 million people, we are influencing policy on a global scale. So, with many other countries looking to follow suit, and perhaps the most exciting one, proposals from the UN Secretary-General for a UN Declaration for Future Generations and the appointment of a special envoy at a UN level for future generations, the UN equivalent of my role, I guess, as well as reforms to the UN's own governance infrastructure, all influenced by Wales. So yes, you can think big. You can think that the impossible is possible, and you can believe that with a bit of bravery, leaving the world better than we found it is an aspiration that we can indeed collectively deliver. Thank you. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Well, that was quite something. You have, thank you. You've given me a greater reason as a Moston with Welsh heritage to go back and spend a lot more time in Wales, not just exploring my family heritage, but to see just what it is that you've been doing in Wales. Thank you, Sophie. We have a little bit of time, and I'm so thrilled that we're being joined on the stage by a national treasure, Professor Fiona Stanley, AC. You know that she is a renowned epidemiologist and distinguished professorial fellow in the School of Paediatrics and Child Health at the University of West Australia. She was the founding director of the Telethon Kids Institute and has spent, I think, most of your life, Fiona, actually thinking about the things we've been hearing about tonight from Sophie in a uniquely Australian context, particularly through the lives of children that have been led and will be led according to the numbers that you showed us, Sophie. So I thought what I'd do, maybe Sophie, I'll give you a little break to have just a sip of water, and I might go to you first, Fiona, because I know, having seen you at many of our very important gatherings in this country, particularly most recently at the Early Years Summit, you were powerfully advocating for us to think differently beyond GDP, thinking about what we measure, what Australians really do value. And it felt to me that it's a cry you've had for a very, very long time, backed up by extraordinary research. And I know, if I go to ask Sophie in a minute how she changes the culture, I know you're worried about the culture here in Australia. So why don't we start with you and talk about what worries you about whether Australia can do anything like the work that Sophie's told us. And then I want to hear from Sophie about how culture does change. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. And again, thank you for a fantastic presentation. And Daniel's still here. I think that the thing that worries me most is the lack of understanding by anyone in power, and I mean the politicians and policy people, of the causal pathways into all of the wicked problems that are facing us as societies. And unless they understand those pathways, they're never going to get to that understanding that you so beautifully described about prevention being more important. The fact that if you want improved health, you don't go to a health service, you go to, in fact, the environments around families and children and what makes for a very positive society. So I'm incredibly excited by your presentation, and I'm incredibly cynical that what is now happening in Australia is going to take us, so it's going to be a huge effort. I'm worried because our treasurer, Jim Chalmers, is leading this. Well, I think we need to think about how do we get all the politicians to be on board with this, which is what happened in Wales. How did that happen? Who was the champion? Who led it? It's got to come out of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and we've got a federation of states. All of them are trying to think about these things, but I think these inabilities of our state premiers at the moment, my anguish is about the children who are in detention who have serious neurodevelopmental disorders. And in most of Australian states, the premiers do not understand that those causal pathways started in utero, could have been prevented at every stage. We failed those children, and now we're locking them up in absolutely inhumane circumstances. that to me is that epitomises, if you like, the problem that I think we have about that understanding. And I just wanted to ask the second thing. So we've got politicians have to be all on board, and the public service. Now, we've just had the most appalling robo-debt. So one of my favourite comments on some of these forums I'm at is, how are we going to get from robo-debt, which actually Sophie knows about, so I don't have to explain, to measuring wellbeing, when we've still got that public servants working in silos, defending their turf, competing for budgets, not understanding causal pathways. So that's sort of really why I'm anguished, but I'm also incredibly excited because we've never had a government before that's now committed to wellbeing. Can't believe it. We've had 10 years of a total dereliction. And we've got people now who are talking about the early years strategy. I've only been talking about this for 35 years, but at least we're still there with our voice, with our data, with our information.
Well, thank goodness we're living to 100 and beyond, because it's been taking a lot of your life to do this with us, Fiona. Sophie, you can hear the anguish in Fiona's question, and you can sense what's been happening in Australia, and why it's so important that you're here showing us what has happened in Wales. I guess if we take Fiona's question in two parts, a society has to change and be ready to come along with a change of this scale. And then the public service, the civil servants, the environment you described where you can actually stop roads being built, and that can't be something that a roads minister retains exclusive domain over, that you can actually encourage and cajole and obviously enforce the role of the future generation when you look at what those departments are doing. First of all, how did you bring the community along? There was a process I know you were involved with. And then what happened with those public servants and the bureaucrats and the politicians?
Well, I think the critical part initially was having that dialogue, the Wales we want, because that gave a kind of, it was the citizens of Wales speaking. Now, I always get asked, how do you know what future generations want, or the unborn want? Well, I can't possibly know because they don't speak to me. Not well, and maybe we can get an AI at some point or some sort of technology that they might be able to. But the best guess that we can get is to ask the current citizens of Wales, and particularly our younger generations and so on. So that was critically important in getting that kind of community buy-in. And the way that worked was there were, of course, online platforms, but there were town hall meetings. There were communities who ran their own Llanelli We Want or the Swansea We Want. There were the Women's Institute who ran within all of their membership groups conversations from their perspective. The young farmers that, a whole range of different communities, school children writing postcards to their future selves and so on. And all of that came together then, and I suppose was analysed to look at what are the common themes and so on. So that was kind of critically important because it gave these goals a kind of a status, if you like. The second thing, which I'm not sure we particularly planned for this, but it was a happy accident, if you like. So the Act was conceived by an Environment Minister who was very passionate about sustainable development. It started its life as a manifesto commitment which simply said, we will legislate for sustainable development. Now, those of you who work in sustainable development will know that, the definition is social, economic and environmental sustainability. But actually, generally, it's the domain of environmental NGOs who are mostly sort of focused in this area, if you like. If it had remained the domain of the environmental NGOs, not to take anything away from them, because they were absolutely critical in pushing the agenda forward with the Environment Minister, I don't think it would have had the power that it has had. And what happened through this national dialogue, yes, it was with citizens, but our organisations started getting involved as well. Our organisations in Wales, like CPD, like our Public Health Agency, and suddenly the public health professionals were going, hang on a minute, this could be a Public Health Act. And then the creative and cultural communities were saying, hang on a minute, we want to be part of this. We could be a fourth pillar. Culture has something really important to offer to this. So they actually lobbied to be statutorily included in the Future Generations Act. So I think what we've, in hindsight, what we've recognised is that was really, really important in broadening out these conversations to the kind of unusual suspects. So it is about the experts who are experts in early childhood development, having those conversations with the environmental NGOs. It is about our business community having conversations with our equality groups. It's about that kind of cross-pollination of ideas and drawing out from that the principles by which people can agree on. That's not always easy, but there are some core principles which a lot of people can agree on. Just back to the kind of the cultural change in organisations. It's got to be a whole-of-government-led approach, which is why it moved from the Environment Minister when it was actually enacted. It did actually initially start with our Finance Minister, the equivalent of your Treasurer, but it wasn't all based on metrics. And metrics are important, but you've got to be really careful not to over-bureaucratise this in its first instance. Of course, you need things to measure progress, but if it becomes a bureaucratic thing where you tick the box and miss the point, you're not getting anywhere. It's about developing understanding. It's about putting in place mechanisms within government for different departments to come together and work together. It's about government saying, we want you to try new things, and if you fail, we've got your back. And it's about the public accepting that to a certain extent as well.
Thank you, Sophie. There's a lot in that, and there was a lot in your presentation, which I'm sure we'll all reflect on. Fiona, do you have a belief that if Australians came together with a national conversation or a national set of discussions, that we could get to understand what Australians really value beyond just the metrics? And a follow-up question, do you think this would be the moment to grab not only the momentum on the wellbeing agenda, but combine it with the momentum on early childhood and the things you've been working on for your life, and put these things together for a uniquely Australian set of conversations about what our ambition could be?
I would love that. And I think, following on what Sophie said and following on all the work that we've done over so many years, it is the citizen engagement that is really vital to this. And it's so exciting because citizens haven't been engaged. They're totally pissed off with politics. Oh, excuse me, I'm in Melbourne. But anyway, totally annoyed with politicians and bureaucrats. I mean, I work a lot with Aboriginal communities, and they are sick and to death of people who don't understand their circumstance, their lived experience, and yet coming in with all the policies that don't work. So it is about engaging as citizens that actually might increase democracy. You've actually explained, Sophie, a democratic process that's happened that's second to none. So I'm optimistic that we could do it. It's huge, but we've got to try it. And I think to engage citizens, what I got from Sophie was the sense that the citizens actually have put pressure on the politicians. And everyone says that's the way to go. You know, we elect these people, we should have them under pressure, but we're not engaging citizens very well at the moment. And I just think that's very exciting. I love this idea of your 16-year-olds adopting these chiefs. I think the reverse mentoring, I just think we should try it straight away.
It's a tough gig.
So Fiona, I'm going to stay with you for a second because I know there's something you would like to, there's someone you'd like to quote this evening. And I wonder whether we aren't in the middle of the opening chapter of a national conversation around the voice. And I hope that we're going to do that well, and that we're going to do that in the spirit of a country coming together and not be divided by it. The current environment would say we're going to have some challenges, but if we trust citizens and we trust a process, I know there's someone that you would like to refer to tonight, an old man who recently passed from up north, and I think it'd be lovely to hear you speak in his words.
Yes, as you would understand, I'm very supportive of the voice, like Sam. And this is Mr Yunupingu, Dr Yunupingu's words from his essay, Rom Wataging, in the Constitutional Referendum document. So this is some years old. He died 2 weeks ago. What Aboriginal people ask is that the modern world now makes the sacrifices necessary to give us a real future, to relax its grip on us, to let us breathe, to let us be free of the determined control exerted on us to make us like you. And you should take that a step further and recognise us for who we are and not who you want us to be. Let us be who we are, Aboriginal people in a modern world, and be proud of us. Acknowledge that we have survived the worst that the past has thrown at us, as Daniel has demonstrated so beautifully. And we are here with our songs, our ceremonies, our land, our languages and our people, our full identity. What a gift this is that we can give you if you choose to accept us in a meaningful way. I get goosebumps. And that's, I think, puts my feelings into what Aboriginal people can give to us. Because a lot of the things, Sophie, that you were talking about, a lot of the models you were talking about are actually Aboriginal models that we're now trying to get, as Daniel said, get that knowledge back. I've been associated with this group of Birthing on Country, which is just overwhelmed me. A week or so ago, we had a big national conference on Birthing on Country, and it's all over the place. And the knowledge, how did they get back the grandmother's knowledge when colonisation was so profoundly genocidal? And yet they have, and it's coming back. And grandmother's way of birthing is exactly how you'd like to have your 5 kids, let me tell you. It's gorgeous.
Thank you, Fiona. Thank you for reminding us of Mr Yunupingu, a very important leader for this country. Sophie, I don't want to go into the negative, but I think it's an interesting time that you are here. We're facing a cost of living crisis, we're seeing growing inequality, and we know that in Wales, and you touched on it, that poverty and those that have never been at the table with rights still have inequality, despite what you've been doing. And I think you've worked very hard to ensure that they are at the table and that the systems are dealt with in an appropriate way to work against inequality. And I guess UBI is one of those key initiatives, and you've said very powerfully where you started. What are your lessons for us as we go into what has been a very prosperous nation that hasn't thought about this much? We start to adopt a wellbeing framework, but we're doing it at a time when there's increasing poverty and a real crisis, I think, in the community around cost of living. And how do you match those two things and build a sort of sense that wellbeing is possible?
I actually think, and I suppose an analogy for us also was, coming out of the pandemic, in that sort of sense of crisis and everything being difficult. And what we found is that having that framework to guide what we do next was actually really, really helpful. And similarly with the cost of living crisis that we're experiencing across the UK and in Wales. Because what it's asking us to do is to do the things which are good for current and future generations and maximise the contribution to well-being. And it's just about framing that thinking differently. So, we could give everyone short-term payments, and we have done some of that because there are some crises that need to be addressed. But the longer-term interventions, which we're also putting in place, things like investing in improving the quality of people's homes. Now, that is a kind of no-brainer in a way, because you fit energy efficiency measures in people's homes. That creates jobs for the people who've got to do that. It helps us to meet our carbon targets. There's your goal of a prosperous Wales. Two issues met there. It helps to the long-term health prospects of people having good work, long-term health benefits there. It keeps older people in particular out of our hospitals in winter months because their homes are now warmer. It puts money back in people's pockets because their bills are now lower because their houses are more energy efficient, and it regenerates communities as well. So that's just thinking about shifting what we might do in response to a cost of living crisis. Could we do this or could we do that? And applying that test of, what is the thing that makes the biggest contribution to all aspects of those well-being goals, rather than just a linear kind of short-term approach. That's where you start to get change. And similarly, with our reforms around public transport, our capital city announced congestion charging today. They've applied the metrics of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, because that investment will go into public transport, which is better for lower income families. It'll reduce air pollution, which is better for our health. It'll help us meet our carbon emissions targets and so on. It also means that sometimes we've got to take unpopular decisions. And we can't shy away from that. And some of that is actually quite difficult, because we're trying to get the public to transform their ways of thinking as well. And yes, you can have these high-level conversations with people about their aspirations, and that's an important part. You've still got to win hearts and minds when you're then doing the sometimes difficult things that actually come from that.
Yeah, thank you. There's so much that we would like to talk to you about. We've got very little time left, and we do want to finish the event about on time at 7:30. So, Sophie and Fiona, I guess one of the last questions I'd like to ask is, when you saw it quite profoundly in the photos you put up of the old coal exchange at Wales then and Wales now, and it takes us to the question of the influence of women and women in the movement towards economics for wellbeing. economists like Kate Raworth, Mariana Mazzucato, who delivered one of the earlier orations for CPD on the very topic of sustainability, Stephanie Kelton, yourself, Fiona, many of the women in the room and across the country. That's not to exclude men, but to say it appears that, and watching you describe what you've been doing in Wales, it feels like women's impact has been significant and the economics that women are bringing to our attention. Is that right? I'd love to hear from both of you on that.
Well, I suppose one of the significant things with Wales is we had initiatives to have a gender-balanced Senedd, Parliament, when it first came into being. So that set the course for the way we do government and politics in Wales. But I think, more broadly, if you look at the World Happiness Index, 9 out of the top 13 countries, happiest countries, either are run or have recently been run by women. So I think that elect women, we all are happier. There we are.
Thank you.
Well, I think it was Obama who just said that if you put everyone, women took over the world, everything would be better. But I think that there's a lot of power in a women's approach, and I love feminine men who understand what community strength is about. And I think one of the things we did, we broke through the glass ceiling. People like me, who became a director and so on and so forth, but what we didn't do was change the workplace, and we didn't make it more feminine, which is what we really should be doing as feminists, feminising the world, because it's about caring. And it's about kids, and it's about all those environments that are supportive and positive. So I'm not an anti-male at all. I just want to feminise them so they're caring, caring and loving as well.
We only have seconds left. I'm going to ask each of you if you want to make a final comment. I just wanted to, let our audience know that, Sophie, you are going to be continuing to be on our airwaves, on our TV screens in the coming fortnight. So keep an eye out for seeing Sophie. You can pick up some of her interviews already. I know the Radio National interview from this morning is already up on the podcast, but keep an eye out. We are heading into a budget, our federal budget and state budgets. And I guess one of the things I suspect you might want to say to this audience is it's our job as citizens to ensure that our treasurers, our ministers, those that seek to represent us, actually take into account the things that you've been leading out of Wales and help us in Australia to think about that. So with that kind of call to action for all of us as we head into Budget 2023, is there anything you'd like to leave the audience with, both of you, just from what you've seen in Australia already, what you're experiencing, or any last comments for this very enthusiastic audience?
Money talks, doesn't it? So, how changing the way in which you spend money is a really good start, but it is a start, and it must lead to wider reform across the whole of government for it to have that transformative effect.
Thank you. Fiona.
Well, my last one is about learning lessons from the pandemic. Because during the pandemic, we found out that privatised services were not serving the population in aged care or childcare, in healthcare even, and that giving something like a universal wage actually worked, and it made politicians popular. So, that was the only time that Scott Morrison was popular, I think, and even with me at one stage, yes. So that's what I think we should not forget how profound that pandemic experience was in terms of how it showed how vulnerable our society was and how strong we could make it so bloody quickly.
Yeah. Do you know what I think we did in that period? I think we trusted people.
We did.
Absolutely.
We did.
We trusted, and so we were able to give payments to people, free childcare to people. Yep. We didn't think that they were going to be rorters. We didn't think they were going to waste it. We knew they would do the right thing.
No need to get a robo-debt to whack the money out of them.
Yeah.
That's right.
So there we are. I think that's also about well-being, that we trust, we build trust.
Absolutely.
We come together as a community and have these conversations. And haven't we been lucky tonight to be led in that conversation by Sophie Howe and Fiona Stanley? Please say thank you to them both. None of you have none of you have left early, so I'm sure there's a bit of mingling to be done. A number of us do have to leave to get Sophie to another commitment. Otherwise, we would have opened the questions to the floor. But I hope you have enjoyed this evening. Thank you for the team at CPD for all the work that's gone into tonight, and thank you for coming along.
Thank you for bringing you out. I've been following Wales ever since you started to what kind of Wales we want. So I've been mentioning it many forums.
That's good. That's good. Well,
so when I heard you were coming, I heard...